sure we.
I know.
Like I almost shout.
I think they're live streaming.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let's do this.
So nobody gave me any beef about any of the questions,
No.
so I'm just gonna kind of
Take it away.
Dude, I think you know that you knew Colleen over at St. Mary's. Colleen, Adelia's wife? Yeah, married there 20 years ago.
interesting. Okay. Who in Healy?
Yeah. This one is going to stay up. Somebody has dropped the mic on that one before.
So tired. I had it was like almost like first day of school. I did not fall asleep last night.
That's lovely.
I was like, are you serious? Can I grow out of this?
Why? I didn't know we're halfway to New Orleans with this air. Humidity. Yeah. I think the humidity. Hey, are we going to get swimmers today?
Yeah. It's kickoff Sunday, baby. Kickoff Sunday. That liturgical holiday
Oh my god.
that is neither mentioned in.
Wait, I gotta fold the paper so I can flick it through. You remember that? I know you guys do this every week, but this feels early for church.
Oh my gosh.
It's gonna take me some getting used to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I was telling Tom. I noticed I had 8 people signed up for my class. I was like, "Oh, that's gonna be a different vibe, than we've had." The late afternoon.
Oh, wow.
These
How
questions
prepared
could
y'all
go
are.
on for a long time. You know what I mean?
Oh, apparently. Okay. Maybe he's just going to say, start talking about it. Are we supposed to start?
Yeah, we'll get started.
Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're glad you're here. This is, I am told, Kickoff Sunday. So glad to see you all here. We are going to have about a 45-minute conversation with the pastors this morning, thinking about the question, why church? Now, that might seem to be a very obvious thing, right? Of course, we come to worship God and to see each other and to sing and so forth, right? But we want to sort of delve a little bit more deeply into what that can mean, maybe some blind spots that we have around that and so forth. So this is going to be a time for our church leaders, our pastors, to kind of reflect openly with us about their own thoughts, about their own stories, and kind of think more deeply about this question: why church? Why do we do this thing that we do? Okay, so I will just start. You may, some of you may know me. My name is Michael Barram. I've been a member here for 22 years, something like that. I'm a professor of biblical studies over at St. Mary's College, and so this is kind of an honor for me just to get to chat with my good friends, and I hope we can think of this in that kind of informal sort of conversational way. We've been through a lot, right, over the last few years with COVID, and we're continuing to go through a lot in terms of political upheaval and questions about what's going on in society and issues of justice and injustice and lots of different things that in many ways, have thrown most of us for a loop in all kinds of ways, or maybe multiple loops, right? So one of the things I want to be honest about, just to kind of start us on a kind of line of kind of raw honesty, is that I'm not a person who naturally gets excited about waking up on Sunday morning and going to church. I just want to put that out there. This is not, I would say most of my friends and so forth, they are not churchgoers, and I'll be honest, I think sometimes they get a whole other day for a weekend that I don't actually feel like I get, often because I'm teaching or whatever, right? But this is an interesting thing we do. And, I'll be honest, during COVID, when we were all, watching services on Zoom, there was a sense, it was like, for me, that was like, this is kind of cool. I missed everybody, to be sure, but being able to sort of occasionally turn on, Zoom or YouTube in my, pajamas or whatever, that was actually kind of neat in a weird way. And so I want to kind of just be honest about the fact that this doesn't, at least for me, come naturally. I'm not a person who sort of identifies with ritual and practice in some of the ways that I need to be open to. And so we want to kind of think just about what this looks like. We've also gone through a lot of change in the church recently in terms of personnel and new policies and various changes, obviously, in our times of worship and things like that, right? So we want to think kind of clearly about what all that means, why we do that, why we do what we're doing. So I'm just going to jump in, if I may, and throw out a few questions, and we'll get as far as we get, and because I always have too many questions. So here's the first one, and there's a long sort of intro into this just to give you all a chance to contextualize this however you want. So in our current and contemporary environment, participating in a church community is becoming increasingly countercultural. This is not something everyone does, particularly here in the Bay Area. Churchgoers are in the minority. Together, over the past year or so, we've explored the question, why Jesus, examining in increasing depth and specificity who he was and is about, what it means to align ourselves with this guy, Jesus. As his followers, we're Jesus' community. We know that church isn't so much a place as it is a community. And for centuries, Christians, have gathered regularly together to worship, to pray, to sing, to learn, to serve together. But to the extent that we're participating in a community following Jesus is now quite countercultural, why do we continue to do this church thing? Because most of our society has decided this is, at best, an optional thing. This is not the kind of Midwestern thing that many of us might have grown up with, where everybody, I used to live in Virginia, and it was amazing. At 11 o'clock, everyone was in church, right? 15 or 20 years ago. Surely we don't continue to congregate just to save the church or to keep this habit alive or because we've built all these nice buildings and we need to do something with them. So why do we gather? Ultimately, why church? This is a question that we probably need to ask again and again. As our colleagues and fellow travelers in faith and as leaders in this community, and I'm turning to the three of you, how would you personally respond to the question, why church? Why? I mean, in the most broad sense. We'll bore down a little bit more later, but in the broadest sense, what is this about? Why do we do this still?
So there is this saying at my former church that I used to work at in New York City that worked very much for New York City, just because like the amount of friction it takes or that exists in your daily life in living in New York City is high, just in terms of transit and getting places and all that kind of stuff. And so there was a saying that one of the previous pastors used, and it was, you can't go it alone in New York City, and so you need community. And so that kind of felt very tactile and real in like a physical sense in terms of needing community, needing people around you in a city where you feel very alone. And in many ways, I feel like modernity, so I'm going to answer your question not in the timeless sense, but in the very timed 2022 sense. I mean, I feel like modernity has upped our efficiency levels, maximization, the illusion of connectedness, whether it's social media or screens or all of these things. And yet we aren't actually tethered together in community. And so I've experienced this in certain ways within the church in which, like for example, I had a friend whose the anniversary of her father passing happened a few months ago. And the church reached out and checked in with her. And it was very much just, I mean, it's not like that's a unique experience to people within the church, right? Everyone has lost someone. But there was something about this community in particular that made just existing on an island not an option, right? And so, and it's not something like it was put in as a calendar reminder, this is what we do as Christians and this is how we behave. It was like, our stories are knit together, and so your pain is my pain, your experience is my experience. I am now thinking about this because I know you're thinking about this, because I think right now we live in a time where we really do feel kind of out to sea, and we can feel out to sea. And so church is the place that, at least for me, I feel tethered to people, sometimes inconveniently so, uncomfortably so, and the only reason that I continue to choose to be tethered to those people is because the covalent bond in this situation is God, right? The covalent bond isn't like dodgeball league, which my affinity for dodgeball might wax and wane, right? And so that is, in this particular point in time, why I think church is absolutely essential to human existence, faith, community, all of those things.
You saying I can go, Tom? No, go ahead. Okay. This relates, I think, to a question you asked a little bit later, but I'm gonna bring that in.
Totally fine.
In my experience growing up, I grew up in what I would call a very normal, dysfunctional family. Notice the two words that I put together, right? That was on purpose. I needed to find a dysfunctional family that would place me into a healing presence that was greater than myself. And that was what happened. And it was the 6th grade woman named Ella Haver who taught my Bible class. It was the youth leaders who showed up when they didn't have to. And they were there to remind me that that while my inner life was falling apart, which I didn't even understand, and that while my family was held together really well but was falling apart inside, and I didn't understand that either, there were at least these people I could be with who helped me make sense of life in a context greater than my own, that helped me with my brokenness. And I think that relates directly to, I think it relates directly to what Charlene just said. The situations and conditions may have changed, but our brokenness and our weariness with life has not. So I would say, without going into any more, what we really missed, while I did kind of like sometimes being at home after, because we had taped, so we were at home on Sundays. That was really nice for a while. At the same time, I missed you. I missed you. And there is another community that I know of where I can say that, and I don't say that just because I'm a pastor here at this church, but I learned early on that I need you. Even Tom.
Yeah.
More than ever.
Yeah, right. Okay, so why church? For me, growing up, church was my alternate family. It was an alternative family. I needed a family. And so church was the place where I was accepted, I was known. As a missionary kid in public school, it's really hard to tell what that means and how that works and so forth. And so I tried to keep that as secret as possible in school because it was so odd. My grandkids even today will say, "Grandpa, you're odd." And they're not saying you're weird in the sense that you have weird experiences. I think they're just saying, "Grandpa, you're weird." So I try to explain that by experiences. But I needed a place where I could be me. and be accepted and be loved just because of me, who I was. And for me, church was the place for that. Later on, as I began to change some thinking and so forth, I found that I wrote a little thing for myself on, is there a place for me? And now, this is after I've been a pastor, I've been back to graduate school, I've changing my mind on some things, critical issues, biblical issues, and there wasn't the same kind of acceptance, frankly. There wasn't the same kind of openness or inclusion. Families are messy, and all of a sudden, we wanted family to be perfect, and it just wasn't perfect. And I was changing, and other people were changing, and so my early years, church was a place of acceptance, of love, of just being who you are. And later, church became more of a place where I had to defend who I was. But one of the things that I love about the Presbyterian Church is that I had space to do that. It wasn't, if I couldn't be where I am today theologically and biblically in the church that I grew up in. But in the Presbyterian Church, there's kind of that space to think and to grow and to reflect in a whole spectrum of, with a whole spectrum of people and perspectives. And for me, that's why I love the church and I love the Presbyterian Church.
That's fantastic. So to build on that, or to kind of to take that another step, I wanna actually read. They didn't know this was coming, but I actually want to read our mission statement as a community, and then kind of get us to think in light of that, at least. So as you all know, our mission statement reads as follows: we are called by God, transformed by grace, strengthened in community, confident that Christ is making all things new. And then the second stanza is, now go, love concretely, even when it's risky, serve generously whoever has need, and pursue God's restoring justice. And as I think Charlene always appropriately continues that from Amos, until justice and love roll down like waters. So in light of that, I want to ask, you've all talked in various ways about how church is where you felt included, where there were needs that were met, where that community is so central. So I guess what I want to ask is, who is the church for? Because sometimes I think, well, I'll be honest, the way I grew up, church was for the people who were in it, right? It was our church. It was what we're about, the concerns that we have, the music that we like, however we want to think about that. So who is the church for? That is, who are we for as Christ followers? What is this campus for? And for whom? How might our mission statement guide us in that regard as we think about being together? Mark, you talked about family being messy. I'm assuming that's not just our nuclear families, but I think probably us, right? We're a family that can be messy. So who is the church for?
I would, when you brought that up, the verse that came to mind was Jesus' saying, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, or to give his life away. And I when you first enter the church, at whatever point that is, whether it's a relationship, the teaching, whatever, you think it is about you because that's your premise for coming. You come to church to get something, some help, some healing. But as you get into it deeper and deeper, you see that the movement goes out. And that's really the way in which circulation works. So I would just say, leave it at that. I would want to say the question of buildings, the question of programs, the question of the kind of people who we have on leadership and staff, and leadership as lay ordained leadership or whatever, is how do we understand and live out that deep truth that Jesus said, that life is about giving it away. I wrote down, what did I write down? Oh, we find ourselves in giving ourselves away. But I need you to help me learn to do that, because sometimes I may lose myself in the midst of trying to find myself and giving myself away. And we need the honesty to put ourselves back and say, hey, wait a second, this isn't just simply about burning all our gas, but finding inner resources together. But I would say that statement, I did not come to be served, but I came to serve.
So I think it has to be parsed out a little bit.
Please.
Because the church is for worship. I mean, we gather together to worship, right? And so in that sense, it's not going to necessarily be the person on the street who has full weekends to go play and all of those kind of things that has gathered. It's those people who are responding to God on this pilgrimage of faith, and what the church then does as it gathers is to worship. So it seems to me that that's one thing. The mission of the church, however, is out there. So I think both. Galatians 6 says, do good to all people, but especially to the household of faith. So Paul's reminding the people in Galatians that we need to care, as Mark was saying, we need to care for each other. The reason we care for each other is not so we can care for each other, but it's so that we can be strengthened and helped and grow in such a way that we can then, I think, do what our Book of Order says, be a provisional demonstration of the kingdom of heaven in the world today. And that's the mission of the church. But the gathering of the church, it seems to me, is for worship.
Okay, so I have to confess that I'm in a very Ecclesiastes state of mind. So my thinking is a little dark right now and blunt. Did
There's a
any of
season
you,
for everything.
other than probably Chris Corwin, read today's passage prior? Yes, you did? Okay. Oh, wonderful. I mean, it is the best. It is basically like we all try to find new things and approach, the world in a new way and ask new questions, and everything comes back the same. Everything is the same. Vanity of vanity. Everything is vanity, right? So it's like, yay, now we go to church. The church has become, because simply by virtue of the fact of how long it has been around, it is an institution that has had the luxury of asking the same questions over and over and over again, right? And we almost have to adapt these questions because we're like, oh my gosh, we've been asking the same questions over and over and over again. So how can we modernize this question? And so I love this question and I despise this question. It is like a very marketing-based question. Like, who do we market the church? Who's our target audience? How do we capture the people we're supposed to capture? And we start like bifurcating the population in terms of, you remember when these terms like seeker-friendly church, that became a thing, and like, oh, today's an outreach service versus an in-reach, and we developed all of these false binaries in which to just organize our thoughts on a ageless, what feels like an ageless topic, right, or subject or question. I have been asked this question even before I was in any position to be answering this question, like, who is the church for? I mean, everybody. The broken. Who isn't broken? I think the danger is thinking if you're in the church, you're not broken. And then now we need to go out in the world and save all those people out there who are broken. I mean, to use our very also optimistic church father, John Calvin, he very clearly laid out that the church, there was an invisible church and a visible church, and they were not the same, right? Like the people who are inside the building are not necessarily the people who God has like looks down on creation and so says, oh, there is this community of faith. And so, and that teaching is not to actually, like Ecclesiastes, make us feel so terrified by the futility of it all, but actually to free us up to be like, oh, like what if we view the church as a community center where we all come in and have something to offer and all come in and have something to receive, right? Because we make it so like, oh, this is the rich and the poor, the put together and the not put together, the sinner and the saint, all of the, no, that doesn't actually exist. But I can understand why we have made an economy around it. And I've benefited from that economy. I am a paid servant of the church, right? And so these are the things that we have built and institutionalized over time, but it is also a slippery slope. So I'm going to challenge the question itself, even though I really appreciate it.
Well, that's actually very helpful, because I was thinking about the question in a radically different way. So the way I was thinking of it,
Fair enough.
isn't this okay, right?
Yeah.
This is church. It's messy. So yeah, when I was thinking of it, I was thinking about what Jake Medcalf was saying last week about the church, and that part of what we've done, at least if I heard him correctly, is we're on the precipice of forgetting who we are always, if what we're thinking is the church is mostly about those who show up and maybe about those who could be served, right? There was this tension, right, where he was reminding us that we serve a guy who is very impolitic at times, that is Jesus, right? Doesn't always follow the most polite paths, tends to throw tables around and things like that, right? So that our assumptions of what we're up to here might need to always be thrown into stark relief, I guess. In other words, I didn't hear in what I was asking as a marketing question at all, more as an identity question, right? But I hear exactly what you're saying. I think that's helpful. And so maybe to sort of build on that a little bit, I guess I would ask, what do you three, and I'm thinking here now again very personally, what do you most enjoy, get filled by, engage with, get filled up by, as Jake was saying last week, by our Sunday morning gatherings? I mean, we're kicking off a new year of, for lack of a better term, programming, right? That will be happening in many cases at this hour, right? So what is it on Sunday mornings that most fires your jets, so to speak, as pastors? Where have you seen beauty in the community? Where have you seen lots of room for growth?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like, let me
I
answer
like to
first.
throw out lots of questions so that they can pick one, right?
Where are your books?
Okay. Okay, I don't want to answer that. I want to go back to the other one. I couldn't stop you.
I'd like to say this is an unpaid position, okay? These all are paid. I'm just doing this,
Okay.
out
but-
of the goodness of my heart. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a dilemma about the church. It seems, and this is, I don't know, I'm wondering. Okay, I'm just wondering. So the church, all the images of the church are corporate, right? They're gathered, they're people, they're building, their community, they're all that, body and so forth. It's all community. Is the church then gathered, and that is when the church is the church? And then when people go out, they are individual disciples representing the church, but not necessarily the church. That's my question.
Oh, okay. I thought it was a statement.
No, well, I'll make it in the form of a question.
All you have to do is add an inflection at the end.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I forgot what I said. So.
Part
But, so who is the church for? Well, okay, so if the church is the church when it's gathered, when we're all together, when it's corporate, and the church isn't necessarily the church scattered, but it's individual disciples that are representing the church. Now, this may not be true, but is that a way to look at the church? And so we then, as individuals, go out there and do our work, our ministry, our love, our whatever we feel called to, as opposed to somehow being the church when we're isolated out.
So I heard your question that you may have asked somewhere in there. I challenge the notion. I feel like it is actually, and this is me drawing from my experience as a part of a Korean American family. It's a very Western notion. So when I went to Korea, the big history lesson was, we are a collectivist society versus an individualist society. And what is the difference between those two things? So for many cultures, I am always an extension of my family name, right? I can bring honor or glory to my family when I'm not in my house. Like, I'm always a Han. When I'm out there, you bring honor to your family name. In that regard, so it's like bringing glory to Jesus when you're out in the world as a disciple of Christ. But then again, I mean, I feel like we're having this conversation. We have a meeting every Tuesday. It's a lunch with clergy, and this is basically what we do the whole time. It's awesome. I love it. It's my favorite part of my week. Is that a false binary? Do we even need to create those boundaries? How helpful is that?
Well, I'm not sure it's helpful or that we're creating them. My question is that the nature of who we are as followers of Jesus? We're the church gathered, we're disciples individually when we're out there. Now, we could gather out there too. I mean, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there in the midst. And I would say that is the church corporate. I just, in thinking about the whole question of why church, what church, I just began to think, is there a difference between the church, which is always, it seems to me in Scripture, corporate, and individual discipleship, which is a representative of the name, a representative of the church, as opposed to I'm the church out there by myself doing something good.
I hear what you're saying. Yeah. So then, can I answer Michael's actual question? Because maybe my...
Did Michael have a question?
Doesn't ever matter.
What do you love about Sunday morning?
Yeah.
Right?
Where do you see beauty? Where do you see room for growth? That kind of thing, generally.
Oh, I didn't. Okay.
You
I
can
didn't
do
hear that
whatever you want with
sub-question.
that.
See, she's trying to change the question too, right?
Well, what I love about Sunday morning, so I was telling Michael, like, I couldn't fall asleep last night, y'all. It was like the first day of school. I could not fall asleep. I was like nervous and excited for church because it is, I mean, I'll admit to all of you here, it's a work day for us, right? And so what I love about the Sunday, not all that to say is we still get to experience church, okay? I'm not saying we don't. But what happens on Sunday, what I love, is those micro exchanges that then turn into what happens for me, Tuesday through Friday. Because I get this question a lot. What do you do during the week as a pastor? Do you work during the week? You don't just work on Sunday? I'm like, that is a very offensive question. But it's like the coffees that I have on the plaza. It's the conversations it's like the working out of faith with fear and trembling that gets to unfold. So what happens in worship is like we get to start a conversation or stir the pot a little bit, but then like what happens in the outside spaces, even in text conversations throughout the week, based upon something that was inspired or incited in worship. From a liturgy, like I'll get these funny emails, all of these things, I get a glimpse into someone's story or life. And that is where I'm like, oh, God is so creative and masterful and omniscient and omnipresent, all of these things. That's where it plays out for me in real life. But this is like the locus in which it, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm not going to answer Tom's question. I'll answer Michael's question, though. I think there's two things. It was a very good question, just for me personally. One is the passing of the peace. If there's anything in the world that we need, it's the reminder that peace governs and rules, even though we don't see it. But taking it from that high altitude level, it's simply to watch people, not just to watch people greet one another, because it's more than greeting, right? We're actually passing the peace of Christ present with us to each other, both as a promise and pledge, but also as the foundation of our lives. How we work out our issues throughout the week as a church or with others is grounded in that peace. But simply that act of, because I'm doing it today, I was thinking about what's it like to stand there and to stand in front of all of you and to say, the peace of Christ be with you. That is such a privileged moment for us, or at least for me, but I'm sure it is with Charlene and Tom, to be in that space, not speaking for ourselves, but speaking for something that we deeply trust and hopefully pray for in our world and our lives. So that's one thing. The other is communion. There is, where else do you do this? Talk about countercultural. I mean, the early Christians, they didn't know what the heck they were doing down there in the catacombs. Were they eating what? What were they drinking, you know? What are they doing down there? That's always been somewhat of a countercultural thing, like, what is that? It is both the mystery and the significance of a vertical, horizontal relationship that cannot be separated. It can't be break it into a binary, as one of our favorite conversations over the last few weeks, is that we're not about breaking things down into binaries. You can't. There's a vertical and a horizontal relationship there of the Spirit that is deeply, and to be able, again, any of those of you who are deacons or elders, you know this too, to stand in front of folks who come to you and to say the body of Christ, the blood of Christ is given for you. That's it. I'll drop the mic now.
So, can I go back to your question now? So
He
for
always
me,
does this.
Yeah. So for me, the most interesting and kind of energizing thing about church is to see the faithfulness of you all and the eagerness to come week after week after week for years and years and generations. That is really inspiring. That's why this work is exciting and fulfilling. It's because of your eagerness to grow in Christ. So for me, that's where it starts. Then in terms of I like the whole liturgy. I like different parts of it in different days, but the confession, I love a confession that makes me confess things that I wouldn't want to confess. But it's leading me to be honest about myself, and I do confess in that time of confession, the passing of the peace, the communion. I love hearing sermons more than preaching sermons. I love hearing them, and I think we have a really solid and fun and exciting kind of ministry in terms of the pulpit ministry today. And so I love listening. So anyway, I like the whole part of it. Sometimes it hits me, the music, all of it, it hits me differently in different times. But the primary thing is to see you all and your faithfulness and eagerness. That's very inspiring.
Yeah, that's helpful, and it's interesting to me that in our conversation, not to re-binaryize things here, but it does seem like we shift back and forth between describing church and worship. And I think those are
Yes.
definitely there,
Right.
absolutely. But we're also kicking off our fall programming this morning, and
Yep.
so I've always been a little bit troubled, and I say this as an academic, with the sort of, well, we do worship and then we do these classes that apparently help us, be better at worship or better at service or whatever intellectual kind of engagement. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you see this, the variety of different programming things, some more formal, some less formal, that are taking place for us in this upcoming season, specifically us? How do you envision those things having the potential to shape and form us into an ever more faithful community, I guess? I'm thinking, kind of broadly, like, what kind of vision and hope do you have for us, kind of individually and corporately together as we enter into this season? What kind of church do you three want to lead? Where are you excited about where we're going, or where you're hoping to lead us? So I'm thinking not just programmatically, but I also don't want to kind of keep it too meta about, sort of kind of this is theoretically what we are as a church. Like, what are we doing? We're about to start.
Okay, I'm ready.
You get what I'm asking? Tom's ready to go. Okay.
Yeah. I am excited about this new season for the church. I feel like this year, we had this conversation this week, this year is going to be a stabilizing year. We've been through rough waters for a number of years in the past, and whether you go back to, who knows when the church split and St. John's, I think it was St. John's, became a church because people in this church decided to leave it and start a different church. I mean, the church is always in turmoil, right? But it seems to me that this particular season right now is going to be kind of a stabilizing. We're getting familiar with each other. We're learning to love each other in all the differences that we have. And I think that's going to be really good and continues to lay a foundation for the season of growth, of inclusion, of diversity, and all of that God is creating in us. I think it's going to be a fabulous year and a good season for the church.
You want me to follow that up?
Sure.
Yes. No, I think Tom's correct. I mean, I've been at First Press for quite a while now, and I've seen a lot of ups and downs. And there is definitely, I would say, a feeling of wanting, desiring, seeking to find stability at many different levels. But I think it's not a stability that would be kind of like a restrictive stability, right? It's the stability that gives, the rebar within concrete, or maybe not the best metaphor either, but it's the ground underneath the plant. It's the roots in the soil that it's that kind of stability that enables growth. But I think what's also the challenging moment for us is that we're a church that has valued the life of the mind highly in the way we approach worship or the scriptures or our cultural thoughts about how we engage the world. And I think that is a good thing, but it can also be something that snags us, right? And I think sometimes it snags us, meaning that when we think about what we're called to do, it's easy to, kind of say, well, maybe and maybe not, and then go back and do the same thing, right? Because the mind has a way of trying to evade what God might be calling us to. So as we go into the future, I just kind of throw that out there as a prayer and as a challenge, because I don't want to, in a sense, lose that. We're in Berkeley, we're in the East Bay, we're near Cal, all that kind of stuff. We do value the life of the mind. But at the same time, let that not be a snag as we go forward, even in our meetings that we have, how we work through our problems and things like that. But I basically agree with Tom, and I think that, Charlene, your leadership has been actually a very stabilizing one for us, and has given us a sense of joy about being together as servants of God in a way that doesn't restrict us, but allows us to be kind of free in our own gifts. And that's another thing that my hope and prayer would be too, The people are not simply doing what they think they need to do, but they are doing what God has given them to do and called them to do, and to feel free in that. And therefore, I'm going to go off my last diatribe here, and that is, we need to learn how to make mistakes and admit it and learn from it, and not feel shame or guilt over it. That is one of the big things I think we need to learn as a church. And in that context, we will have stability and love for each other.
To go back, I appreciated that you noted that a lot of what we mean when we say church is the hour of worship. And so I think by the nature of that, then we tend to put on some sort of hierarchy other aspects or facets of the church. And I don't necessarily think that's intentional. I think it's largely because of the amount of people who are in worship versus this formation hour or the fellowship hour. But I think you're right. I think we, again, going back to my earlier very Ecclesiastes grumpy, perspective on life right now, I feel like it is the church's way of programmatizing the life of the community. And again, I am someone who's benefited by that fact, right? Like if we look at Acts, like if you're saying what's my vision for the church, it always comes back to this beautiful vision of an entirely engaged community where the boundaries are super porous, right? Where church is happening in someone's house at a dinner table. It's happening in an exchange with, a widow or an orphan on the street, or it's happening in poring over texts and studying scripture and prayer and praying together for the purpose of then lather, rinse, repeat, going back, just being in the world. And so someone asked me this question, if you looked out into the pews in 5 years, and you looked at the church, what would you feel really proud if you saw? And I said an entirely engaged community. I've used the word ecosystem before, but I think probably one of the downsides of the church's height, when the church was at its biggest and most prosperous and successful, and I'm not necessarily talking about this church in particular, but the church in general, the mainline church, was that it was very easy for church to become transactional. You came to church, you got your sermon and your lesson, and then you left. And oftentimes that transaction, like going to a restaurant, was based upon, okay, who's preaching or what's happening or what's in my schedule and that kind of a thing. And you went to your classes, and everything in church was to be partaken and to be experienced. And that's not the Acts church, right? And again, I understand how that has become a product of modernity. People are working 60 to 80-hour jobs. It's not like you have time to go to worship and volunteer in Sunday school and be in the choir. In fact, one of the biggest concerns with this new schedule, which, let's be honest, it's just a container. It is not the stuff itself. It's not the meat or the meal. It's the container, was that it would make people unavailable to do one thing if they chose another. Like, I want everything at the buffet. I want to be able to have it all. And we're contending with the fact that we do not have limitless hours in the day, right? And so how do we engage in this community, not as recipients, but as participants? And so that is my dream for the church. And so I think that gets lit up when you have different ways of engaging. Like worship, so much of it is this pulpit and the front and then the congregation, and even that feels like theologically a little askew for me. But in these new learning communities where it's smaller groups, I think the church was meant to be the type of community where you cannot be invisible, right? Like in a smaller community and you miss a session, by all means miss a session, but I hope someone misses your face and says, hey, is everything okay? Just wanted to check in with you. Like, if we are setting up the community in that way, then I think we're doing our job as a church in terms of being an ecosystem, and not a restaurant. I think it's the alternative metaphor in that. So I'm excited about all the ways and building back in fellowship, because one of the things that we heard from the entire world after the pandemic was how much we missed just face-to-face time with one another. And yet, very quickly, we reverted back to the old rush and hustle of just filling our time, right? And so we were finding ourselves after worship running to things. And we wanted to give space to be able to stop and have a conversation, hear someone's story, meet someone new, and in doing so, be a more welcoming community. Like, all of this is based around what Tom said earlier. Do I have a place here? This is not some trendy, inclusive, now we live in a woke world where everyone, no, it's like biblical, right? Where every single person who encounters Jesus in a transformational experience is essentially asking the question, like, do I have a place before you? Do I belong? Do I matter? Am I loved? And we want every facet of our church life to unequivocally say, yes, you are loved. You belong here. You matter. The end.
Thank you all. That was helpful to me. The first time ever, I actually went through all the questions I wanted to ask. So if you'll indulge me, we've got about 8 more minutes. I want to ask a question for myself, of the 3 of you, and hopefully you all will not find this unhelpful. One of the things I struggle with, and I say this partly as a Bible scholar, but also as a lifelong person trying to tag along after Jesus and figure out what that all looks like and ought to look like or could look like. It seems to me that Jesus was gathering a community, but part of what he was doing, it seems to me, and you say biblically, right, was he was suggesting that this gathering was kind of a foretaste of God's whole community. He called it the reign of God, the kingdom of God, right? That this isn't just in the great by and by in heaven someday, but there's a foretaste of what God is creating right now. And I guess I'm always wondering, what does that look like and for us here? And how do we, maybe what I'm asking is, what's our posture as a church? And let me frame that a little bit, and I apologize for going long, but there's a reason I'm asking this. The ancient Israelites and the early Christians were always, always, always vulnerable. Politically, socially, economically. And a lot of times I think it's hard for us to remember that, because by about the 4th century of the church, everything transferred into the church having power. And the church that I grew up in, in the 70s, still had a lot of, the mainline church still had a lot of influence and power. And as I said, 11 o'clock, everybody was in church, right? We read the Bible, we think about worship, we pray together as members of arguably the most powerful nation on earth. We live in empire. Mm-hmm. And yet we read and we study and we follow someone who was under the thumb of empire. Mm. Do you catch what I'm getting at? And that is a challenge, it seems to me, for how to, not so much what we worship, how we worship or what we study or what we discuss, but how we do it. What's our frame of reference? What's our frame of mind? Where are our hearts in that? I want to think about, what are we doing here as a foretaste of the kingdom, of the reign of God, recognizing that it's actually hard for us to hear the message from the position of vulnerability that Jesus was giving, that the prophets were giving, that Moses was speaking into, when we read and hear and think from a perspective of, for the most part, generally, power, privilege, comfort, convenience. How do we be church? So I'm moving from sort of why church to how church. when that's our context? And I didn't prepare you for this, so maybe none of you will want to answer that, but I'd love to just throw that out.
There you have the theme for our next panel. Right? I think it's a very important one because it cuts right down through each of us in terms of to what are we giving our whole allegiance to, right? So I don't really have an answer to it other than to say that we need to pursue this line in a prayerful, thoughtful way because power's deceptive, right? I think we need to realize that there's a lot of deception that goes on. And you start challenging that, and you'll be vulnerable, not because your doctrinal securities are being threatened, but because your livelihood may be threatened. If I were to say what it would be like to be a part of a church where we're having to support certain individuals in this congregation because they've stood out, and for the name of Jesus, they have given themselves and their lives are in danger, or their certain situations are in danger, we need to help them. Not that we're seeking to go out and do that, but I do think that power and authority is something that really needs to be right on the table. And I think my sense is that Jesus, he was under the thumb of empire, but somehow he was able to walk right through that, even to the point of giving his life up to death. So it's what does that say to us? So I actually think there's a lot more to this that we could get into.
For me, one of the things that means is to listen to people who have not had that privilege. And that's one of the things that we're learning with the whole, from my point of view, white supremacy and all of that, that my normal is not everybody's normal. Of course. And so how do I listen to those whose normal is really not coming from a power privilege point of view? So for me, that's one thing. And I think it's, I don't want to be reclusive. I think one of the reactions was the monastic movement to the wedding of church and state, and some people said, no, that's not right, and they responded. I want to accept that and maybe use that for the good of the kingdom, for the good of Christ, but I need to understand that I am in a privileged position. And so for me, that's been the struggle to even admit that, because my normal, I thought, was everybody's normal, and it's really not.
So what is the cost of discipleship? Our lives. And so I think the posture of the church should be that of one not trying to save the church. And so I remember early on in the pandemic, I was asked to sit on this pastors network panel, and it was like the best practices. How are you surviving in the pandemic, and what are you doing to save your church? I signed up because I was like, yeah, good question, this is a good timely topic. And yet sitting through the conversation, I was like, wait, this doesn't sound like the right conversation we should be having right now. Again, Jesus is abundantly clear about us losing our lives and gaining it in the process. And so, to come full circle in terms of how the church has institutionalized and evolved over time, it makes sense that we have a lot to maintain, right? And especially from where I'm sitting, there is so much goodness to maintain in this church. But the posture that I would hope for, challenge myself on, is not a posture of fear or a posture of holding on, but a posture of how can we give ourselves away? How can we lose our lives for the sake of humanity, for the sake of Christ? And I know that we've heard about how to do that in stark terms, and I think it starts with just a change of posture. And I really hope from Tom's mouth to God's ears, that we develop stability not for the sake of our comfort, but so that instability we can be more courageous and daring and bold and risky in how we love, right? Because it's from when you feel like you're taken care of, when you feel like you're loved, you have the capacity to turn around and do that in ways you never imagined. So that's my hope. I also wanted to say apologies in advance if you see the three of us just book it to the sanctuary. We have to do a sound check before worship, and would love to connect with you all after worship in the plaza and answer any more questions. So please do not take it as us avoiding community as we head to do our sound check and worship.
So let's, if we can thank our pastors for their honesty.
And Michael.
And I also want to say a word of thanks to Grace and to Devin. Devin was very instrumental, and Ralph, all the folks, I may have missed a few behind the scenes. Thank you for all the hard work that makes this 45 minutes take place. Let's enter this season with that sense of receptive hands, open to what God may have for us to discover, rather than the hands that I was taught to grow up with in the church, which is more like this, right? Like, we have the answers, we need to fight to make sure we all stay on the right, what would it mean for us to learn, to hear, to see with new eyes, new ears, and new posture of humility and a desire to follow wherever Jesus leads. Thanks for being with us. I hope you enjoy, and we'll sign up. I think, Grace, there are sign-up sheets outside. Is that correct? For a lot of the different offerings that will be starting officially next week. But thank you for coming to the kickoff, and we'll look forward to seeing you over the next several months.